there aren't too many cars on the road that can compete on cool factor with this merino yellow Volkswagen Kombi behind me. Although this bay leaf green Volkswagen ID Buzz would probably factor somewhere on the list. Here on the Chasing Cars channel, we've already reviewed the ID Buzz on its home turf in Europe, in fact on a road trip over the Alps, which was pretty cool. Now we're back in the warmth here in Australia at our test track, and we've brought the ID Buzz really to meet its earlier generational relative. The Kombi we've brought along is Mark's car. It's a 1979 T2, which was fully imported from Germany rather than manufactured here in Australia, as some earlier ones were. And in today's video, just a light-hearted look at the differences between these two cars. How do they drive differently? How far have their interiors come in 44 years separating these two cars? That's what we're going to find out. Before we get started, hit subscribe. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Mark's Volkswagen T2 Kombi was built in Germany in 1979. It arrived in Australia at the port in Melbourne, but was sold new in Sydney. The first family that owned this microbus had it for 20 years. And in fact, it's only on its third owner now at a solid 44 years of age. Of course, the Kombis were all rear wheel drive and in fact rear engined. This one's got a 2-litre flat four producing 51 kilowatts of power, driven to those rear wheels through a 4-speed manual. No air conditioning in these cars. They are very old school, but I think the one thing you'd say about them is that they are effortlessly cool. This is really the idea, the motivation that Volkswagen wants to tap into for the ID Buzz, but also for the brand as a whole, because I think in Kombi days, that was really when Volkswagen was at the very peak of the love affair with the public that ran both ways. Now, at this year's IAA Munich Motor Show, Volkswagen's senior top brass say they want to re-embrace that love brand feel. And if they want to do that, tapping into the affection for cars like this is a big part of it. Enter the ID Buzz. This is just one of a number of fully electric Volkswagens on the way to Australia. But while all of them are competent and seem like pretty good cars from our first impressions from them, I think it's this one which is easily the most lovable to look at. Wouldn't you agree? You can let me know down below in the comments. The ID Buzz is unashamedly retro. You know, over the last few years, there's been some disparaging remarks about retro in the car industry, and putting that to one side, but I think that Volkswagen are correct to embrace the sort of Kombi modernized aesthetic for the ID Buzz. I think this is one of the coolest looking EVs on the road, and I for one am looking forward to seeing the ID Buzz on the road in Australia when it launches in 2024. Now, this one is an ID Buzz Pro. It's got a 150 kilowatt electric motor on the rear axle, so like the Kombi, it is in fact rear engined, rear wheel drive. It is over a ton heavier than the old Kombi. It's got a big battery between the axles, accounting for much of that weight. Though of course, modern safety regulations these days dictate much about how a car looks and also much about how it weighs. Isn't this groovy? I've got to tell you, I get a kick out of this. Obviously, I spend most of my days in this job jumping in and out of SUVs and dual cabs. So when you get to drive a couple of vans like this, it is honestly one of the best days. So look at this exercise in ergonomic simplicity here in the Kombi, partially because frankly, it doesn't have that many features. So we don't have to worry too much about placing stuff around the joint. You get this enormous 2-spoke steering wheel here in the Kombi. We've got a very simple windscreen wiper and indicator and headlight control coming out of that. 3 pedals, because of course this is the 4-speed manual. Not sure the 13 ball was factory, but absolutely love the addition. We've got a little chart here for the map of the gears as well. The Kenwood MP3 player didn't actually come from factory in this car. Oddly enough, that's been retrofitted, but in quite a sympathetic way, with some speakers in the doors. But much like the ID Buzz, frankly, this is a light, bright, fun place to spend time. Not so hot in the summer here in Australia because of these good old sheepskin covers. Everyone should think about those, especially in an old car. But we've got sort of the brown vinyl up on the doors. We've got the yellow body color, super evident here in the cabin as well, and the light headliner too. So just like the ID Buzz, feels super cheerful in here. But of course, none of the modern conveniences like power seats, massaging seats, air conditioning, anything like that. But hey, the car's 44 years old. jumping in the ID Buzz, what you find is really an oasis of calm. This might be the best interior on a modern Volkswagen, not necessarily from like a luxury or plushness perspective, more the layout, the color choice, the ergonomics. It's just a nice place to spend time. Recently, when we were in Europe, I reviewed an ID Buzz that was black on the outside and with the light interior. This one is the gorgeous bay leaf green outside, and you can see in the cabin there's heaps of bay leaf green highlights as well. It all just looks and feels really welcoming, pretty lovable if I'm honest. Love the wood veneer up here on the dash, that's really cool too. The seats in particular are super comfortable. They're ergo comfort massaging seats. They've got these dinky little armrests here. Now the infotainment probably could be a little bit better, will probably be improved further by the time the car gets to Australia, just in terms of things like the climate controls and all that. It's still touch capacitive over there and on the wheel, but you know what, this car is so much fun to spend time in and drive that I kind of ignored that while I was driving it in the Alps. I kind of just got used to it and got on with it, and frankly that worked. So for me, it's not the biggest bugbear out there. Look, you can find things to criticize. Some of the materials are pretty scratchy. It's a van, it's meant to be durable, but on the whole, looks really cool, presents really well, and it's comfortable, and it has loads of storage space. This is a 3-row vehicle, much like the ID Buzz will be when it spawns the long wheelbase model at a later date. We've already seen it, still needs to be locked in for Australian consumption, but the Kombi has the 3 rows. So you can see the original upholstery color here, mission brown vinyl, still looks really good. The car was repainted in 2007 outside, but this was the factory color. So in terms of classics that are in a state to be driven, like this is not a Concours Kombi, but in terms of cars to be driven, it has actually been looked after really respectfully and is a good representation of what this would have been like when new. So we've just got a very simple bench seat here for the second row, exactly the same job for the third row as well. So this is an 8-seater. This car, the 3-row ID Buzz, will be a 7-seater when it arrives. Interestingly, a note on price. So these cost just under 10,000 Australian dollars when they were new. That is now worth about $60,000 in 2023 currency form. So even though this was definitely a premium car in Australia when it came out in terms of how it was priced against Holdens and Fords, it was still pretty far below how much we think the ID Buzz will cost, which will be 100 grand, maybe a bit more. Naturally, the ID Buzz has huge sliding doors on both sides of the van. You can operate it with the latch there. There's a button up front, there's a button on the key, super easy. This one's the 5-seater. There will be a 3-row version coming. Hasn't been locked in for Australia yet, but I think it'll absolutely come here. But this is likely to be the launch car, so just 2 rows, which is definitely less practical than that Kombi, but it's very spacious here in the back, isn't it? So huge legroom behind my own driving position. We've got airline tray tables for a bit of lunch, an iPad slot right there. We don't have air vents though, which is weird. I said that in my German review and they haven't appeared, which is not a surprise, but I think there is probably some air channeled from the ducts under the seat, and there are big air vents in the front, but obviously it should be in the back as well, shouldn't it? That being said, the Kombi doesn't even have air conditioning. All right, well, this is actually my first time driving a Kombi, and in some ways it's a bit of a nerve-wracking experience because, I mean, this is somebody's pride and joy, and it's awesome of Mark to share it with us today in the lead up to the ID Buzz arriving in Australia. But this is an old car. My idea of an old car is like a E46 BMW 3 Series, for instance. This is really old. But the interesting thing is that it's actually really quite easy to drive. Not one of the most punishing classics I've driven. It actually makes a little bit of torque, you know. It's only got 51 kilowatts of power, which is very modest, but I didn't stall it driving off, which kind of surprised me. We're in third gear here at 60 kilometers per hour. You can hear the engine. It's funny because the sound is so distinctly from the back. Oh, where's second? There's second, all right. We made it. 4-speed manual, definitely the right kind of transmission for a car like this. Hilariously long shifter. The clutch has got good feel to it. The ergonomics are really weird for my body shape. I'm sort of sitting quite forward, and it's funny because like sometimes I describe steering wheels in cars as feeling like a bus. I mean, this is a bus steering wheel. but it's so fun to drive and you're sitting so far forward. You know, you can see absolutely everything in this car. You need to give it a bit more brake than you might be used to in a modern car for sure. But you're just sitting in a fishbowl, really. You can't do it that way anymore because of safety regs. I mean, in a crash in this thing, you kind of are the crumple zone, so not ideal. Got a bit of a connection to cars like this because my nana went across the Nullarbor in a Kombi back in the 70s, probably in one much like this. So while my Kombi road trip was in an ID Buzz over the Alps, go back 45 years, and there she was in a much simpler, much hotter, much slower car in much more demanding terrain. So that must have been absolutely amazing. And it's so cool to be able to get to drive one of this era. This isn't one of the earliest Kombis out there, but it's pretty old. And this one is in such a great condition for a classic because it's drivable, you know. This car is not in absolutely perfect nick, but it's pretty darn good. But it's the kind of thing that you would be able to drive without feeling too guilty, just like we are today. And I think that has so much appeal to me. Now, I was chatting to Mark, who owns this car, about how the Aussie Kombi community feels about the ID Buzz. And he says, honestly, they're split. There are some like him who think it's great, and he's got an ID Buzz sticker on this Kombi. He's right into it. There are some that don't love it, are not really into the retro thing, don't think it's a Kombi. But ultimately, it's okay to have either of those views. And I agree with Mark when he says the ID Buzz is going to create a whole new generation of people that love Volkswagen's vans. And I sort of think for my generation, growing up in the back of our parents' SUVs, you know, there is a desire to look for a family car format that isn't just what everybody else has. And that's kind of what the ID Buzz is getting at. The other thing it's getting at is it's trying to replicate this experience in the 2020s, which is not easy to do. And to be frank, there's not that many similarities about how these cars drive. It's really mostly about how they look. And given advances in modern driving dynamics and safety, that's pretty much fine with me. So pulling away now in the ID Buzz, and the first thing you notice is what you don't notice: noise. It's so much quieter than a 44-year-old Kombi with heaps of open space and a sort of chortling flat four engine. So no great shock there. But the refinement level of the ID Buzz is actually really good, as I discovered on my relatively long distance road trip in recent weeks and months. It's a relaxing car to drive. It is also a cool car to drive, both in the sense of how it looks outside and in the climate you're able to maintain inside. Because unlike the mustard Kombi, we do have air conditioning here, and it works pretty effectively, especially up front, to cool this cabin quickly. And because it's got a light interior, it doesn't build up too much heat in the summer sun. Of course, this is an automatic because it's just a single speed transmission, so we don't have to worry about shifting gears. In the ID Buzz, we do have to choose between regular drive and also B mode, which is more regen braking, which is a nice, even more relaxing way to drive because you can just sort of lift the throttle and you're getting a moderate amount of regen braking. But unlike some EVs, the ID Buzz doesn't have one pedal driving, so you do actually have to use a brake pedal, which has been tuned quite nicely, and the brakes are so much stronger in the ID Buzz compared to the Kombi. One thing they actually have in common though is that the front brakes are disc in both cars and the rear brakes are drums. It's a bit back to the future in terms of the drum brakes on Volkswagen's EVs, but because of the contribution of the regen braking, the view is actually that they don't need discs on the rear, and the braking performance of other MEB cars we've tested seems to bear that out at our test track. We haven't done performance testing on these cars today. This is a pre-production ID Buzz and the Kombi is a Kombi. As for the ride and the handling, it's actually really car-like, SUV-like. It's comfortable, pretty supple, the steering's nice and direct, and you can actually hustle the ID Buzz pretty quickly down a good country road, and it's also happy to just do the commute, do the school run, cruise down the highway. Highway efficiency, not so great. I think it was around the 350 Ks of highway range mark when I tested the car, but the urban efficiency is actually quite good. Sub 20 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks, very decent for a big heavy car like this one. and it can charge at relatively decent speeds as well. Of course, with the Kombi, you can just fill it up at any petrol station. The ID Buzz, you will need to have a charging setup, but that is the way of the modern world and the transition to EVs. But all in all, naturally, this is a much better car to drive. It perhaps has a little bit less charm, but it's got a lot more charm than heaps of the cars that we do test. I really enjoy being up here driving the ID Buzz. Not perfect, but it is a rewarding and satisfying experience to drive this big, quiet electric van. And of course, it's got safety. We are not right up against the glass. We still have a really interesting view forward with a huge windscreen that's quite far away from us. But this car has a grapple zone. It's got a 5-star rating from Euro NCAP. It's got lane keep assist, adaptive cruise, AEB, all that stuff, which of course you don't have on a classic. So, a verdict? Well, that's pretty hard. Here at Chasing Cars, we normally assess cars against things like performance, ride quality, refinement, all of which the ID Buzz is way better at than really any Kombi on the road. But of course, one thing that's hard for us to judge is cool factor. What I'll say is my opinion. Of course, the Kombi is just effortless. It was the forerunner for this entire idea. So no wonder the yellow T2 that's turned up today is really the coolest car of the bunch here. That being said, I don't think I've ever seen an expression of retro as successful as the Volkswagen ID Buzz. To me, the ID Buzz looks perfect. It's exactly the appearance of what it should be doing. Yes, allowances have had to be made for a big battery, for modern safety features, all the things buyers expect these days, but I think Volkswagen has pretty much pulled this one off. That said, we still haven't done a thorough road test on real roads with bumps. Our track here is really prepared for us to do these videos rather than drive cars into potholes, so looking forward to properly road testing the ID Buzz. But the first signs are good, so stay tuned, hit subscribe down below, let me know your opinions on these cars in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.